Okay, so the PBS Idea channel posted up a video yesterday called "Is YouTube Making People Smarter?" And I thought it was a good video, very interesting, a lot to say there. I'm going to post a link to it, and I'm going to say some things about it and see if I can't get some other people to respond to that video or perhaps this one. Okay, I think the first thing to say is, in a blanket way, probably yes, that there is a sense in which we could say common sense as a baseline has been elevated by YouTube. That, you know, one could make the claim that a person in their everyday life, people in their everyday lives, when they're walking around and they hear someone give an argument which they find questionable, or they think, there's no evidence for any of those claims, they can go to YouTube and they can find, very likely, a video to settle that dispute, or at least to provide some pretty solid evidence that leads toward a counterclaim, right? There's lots and lots of really great information provided by experts in their fields, and it's not just scholars and academics talking about academic things. It's everything from people in their lives doing their taxes, setting up a business, learning how to juggle, learning how to sculpt, learning how to play the guitar, learning how to put on makeup. I mean, it's all kinds of things that are there. So in some way, you could say that YouTube is a kind of microcosm of endless information forms that give people this greater access with greater ease to more information than people have ever had before. Just can't be denied. And although some of it is questionable and anybody with a camera can just post up whatever, there's really good stuff that's credible, that comes from what might as well have been peer reviewed, because the sources who are posting it are trying to post valuable public information that will stand, to, I guess, public forms of scrutiny or even academic forms of scrutiny. And okay, so in that sense, yeah, we'll grant all that. Okay, very good. But I think the better question, or the question that I would want people to turn to, or let's haggle over, is to what extent is YouTube really deeply changing what we mean by smart? Is smarter, whatever that word means, is it really meaning something very different as we now move to video and video vlogging, and I guess the changeover from book culture? Now, it could be very well that it'll never displace books. And that would be part of the question. Is it a supplement and an addition to traditional reading and writing and study? Or is it something wholly new and innovative, and it's going to replace that, and people are no longer going to read because they can just get access through the videos? See, this is where I'd want to have the haggle. Because I think if it is the latter, no, it's not going to work. I think it's going to have to be an integration and a balance of both. And let me see if I can't lay out just a little bit of why I think books are so valuable and so different, and why the definition of smart seems to be changing. Okay, it seems like books they're much more individual, that the individual, through solitary study, and it's often felt to be hard-won, you learn to adopt the perspective of another person. You internalize their view. Now, you may come to critique it and revise it and want to challenge it, but in the original act of reading, the text is silent and you have to give it voice. So much is this the case that even people who have recently had throat surgery, when they just had that, they may get advised to not read immediately after the surgery, because your voice box, your larynx, all the physiological apparatus that is associated with speech production, it gets activated while you're reading. that you, even if you're just reading silently, you actually give voice to the text. And that's part of how you internalize it. You know, William James has this great line where he says, there's no impression without expression. That somehow as we express things, they impress upon us. And reading is more of an expressive act than I think would appear when you just look watching some person, you know, skim their eyes over a text. And I think the other thing about text there is that when you're reading a text, you can look at the index, you can scan ahead, you can scan back, and it really does allow for a forward advancing and a back scanning and a moving at your own pace. You can skim ahead, skim back, you can reflect, you can make some notes in there and easily access it. Video is so different. It just doesn't have any of those characteristics. It's as if when you're in a video, it moves at its pace. You don't have to produce sounds as you're listening. In some way, you can multitask. You can be maybe even reading while you're listening to a video go on in the background. Maybe you're watching it attentively, but you don't have to engage in speech production to listen to it. It's a different order of interaction. And there's something about it where it doesn't feel to be internalized to the same extent, and it doesn't feel hard earned and won in the same way. That is, one may not cherish internalized knowledge in the electronic age. Instead, one feels satisfied if one knows one can access relevant information if one needed to know it. Rather than trying to become a knowledgeable individual and cultivating oneself against a text and through text and internalizing that, people collectively just, I guess, operate with a capacity to imagine that if they need to know it, they can get access to it, and then it'll be relevant, you know, in their application right then and there. And think too about, you know, a video does not really allow for you to move at your pace. You're stuck moving at the pace of the person who's speaking. If they're speaking really quickly, you can move right along, but if they're speaking slowly, you're caught with that. You know, it's such a different phenomena than text. You can't skim ahead, can't skim back. Now you can try to leave in little numbers for indexing. It doesn't really allow for indexing. I think the difference too on how much is it felt to be internalized and won. So take generations of people earlier, or, you know, older folks. If you ask them how many poems do they know, how many phone numbers do they know, just how much information do they have internalized, there's a sense in which a bulk of them feel as if what they know is deeply in them, and they cherish that. It's sort of what they value is in being a knowledgeable person. And they may know quite a bit. If you ask younger people today what they know, they may know no poems by heart, may know no one's phone number, they might not even know their own. They pride themselves in being able to access the information. They don't think of knowledge as something to be internalized. Now, it's partly because the information explosion, right? There's so much to know, you almost can't imagine someone trying to internalize it. They would just either have, you know, mental meltdown, or I don't know, I don't think they'd be able to do it. They just get exhausted, right? They just get a fatigue and give up. And I think that's part of the response, that people end up saying, well, I don't want to have to internalize it. And maybe they don't, but if they don't, then that really does change what we mean by being smarter. Is smarter a collective resourceability and accessibility of determining what's relevant or not relevant? But then we're to this other issue of how hard won is it? See, I think there's a sense in which some people through reading have cultivated this capacity to tolerate a difficult text. It's as if the text itself, it can't be made any more simple. I mean, their texts are of the past. There they are. They've been written. Maybe they weren't written that well, and they don't have visual aids accompanying them. And so we struggle with them. And even if they're pretty well written, a text by Plato can be pretty easy to read, but still difficult to get exactly what the claims are implying, or what we're to take from the arguments or the dialogues. And people who have read them and studied them, and they've studied them again, and they've argued with other people about them, they come to internalize a kind of knowledge about it. The video, it almost seems like if a person can't understand it, they look to another video that's more easily accessible, and they want to blame it. Like if the material seems too difficult, soon enough they will say, well, someone else must be able to explain this more clearly. And I've recently even heard someone talk about this in Final Cut Pro. I have a colleague who teaches it, and she was saying that when Final Cut Pro first came out, students would sit all night learning. They would sit up all night learning to use the program. They would try to figure it out, and they would struggle through it, and they would try to gain mastery with it. Whereas younger people today will have a tendency to, they look at it, they struggle, and they give up almost immediately. And their thought and their justification is someone is going to come up with an easier program than this, that it can't be this difficult. And this changeover in expectations of how much, I guess, intellectual muscle one is going to have to bring to it may also be changing. And so I think, again, the larger discussion I would want to see people have is YouTube potentially going to displace books and book culture? Is it necessarily going to be a combination? And what will we do with some of these dynamics of how differently we internalize knowledge when we read, and how we learn to accept struggle and difficulty as part of growing ourselves, as opposed to the kind of sensibilities that come with ease and access and, I guess, the immediate consumability that comes from some kinds of things on the YouTube. Okay. Be interesting to see what the brain science is going to show over multiple generations. At any rate, I would love to see some people jump into some of those discussions. I enjoyed that video. Okay, thank you.